This program is sponsored by the National Endowment for Humanities. Welcome to the William C. Goodridge Freedom Center and Underground Railroad Museum. Thank you for joining us for our Preserving Voices of Freedom project. The William C. Goodridge Freedom Center and Underground Railroad Museum will host 6 Live and Learn events. These events will engage the community in discussions surrounding culturally relevant and historically significant topics.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Goodridge Freedom Center and Underground Railroad Museum. This is our third episode of Preserving Voices of Freedom series, sponsored by the National Endowment for Humanities. This evening, our living history interpreters will be discussing microaggression, now versus the 1800s and early 1900s. Backstage questions will be posed by me, Kelly Summerford, manager of the Goodridge Freedom Center Underground Railroad Museum, and Allison Renner, photo curator of the Goodridge Freedom Center. Thank you, Allison, for helping this evening.
You're welcome, Kelly. Let's start with what the definition of microaggression. Microaggression is a term used, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicates hostile, derogatory, or negative, prejudicial slights and insults toward any group, particularly culturally marginalized groups.
Before we begin, will each of our guests tell our audience who you are? Let's start with Basil Biggs first.
Good evening. My name is Basil Biggs, and I was born in 1819, there in Carroll County, Maryland. My mother died when I was 4 years old, but I learned quite a bit with these hands. Learned as a longshoreman, and I got married, met my lovely wife, and we moved to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1858, and began a new life there as an entrepreneur and farmer and an owner until the Confederates came into Gettysburg around June of 28th of 1863. And there I had to leave, but I returned. And after that, my wife and I and others, we became quite successful according to Negroes at the time. But I'm glad to have been spirited back into this 21st century and to see what's been going on in these days with regards to my people and economics and religion and education. So I'm just grateful to be alive to be able to share with my good friend here, whom I recently met.
Thank you. Well, I am Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I was born in 1929. I often referred to concerning my I Have a Dream speech, often referred to as a civil rights leader, in which I was invited to take part in. I used the term invite. It was not something that I necessarily aspired to be a part of. Shortly after receiving actually my PhD, I was invited to lead the movement in civil rights. Though I often don't like being necessarily categorized in an arena where that was the singular movement in which I was moving towards, because a big component of the movement was actually pertaining to economic equality as well, not just civil justice, but also economic justice. And are fighting for a fair playing field in terms of economic distribution.
Well, thank both of you for giving our audience an idea of who you are. Though, Mr. King, we have heard many of your speeches over the years, so we kind of have an idea of who you are. And because of your cadence, all of us try to talk like you.
Well,
And Mr. Biggs, this is your second time back with us. Recently, you were spirited back for our first episode. And we
Indeed.
know that you will continue to share your wisdom.
Indeed.
Now, I know both of you have read the papers from today and often are spirited back in time. But here are a few examples of what people would typically say is microaggression.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Something like, you are not like the others, when referring to a racial group, religion, or gender.
Mm-hmm.
Or you may hear something, Mr. King, like, is that your real hair?
Yes.
Or, Mr. Biggs, you are quite handsome for a dark-skinned person.
Yes. I
So-
acknowledge that.
Our question is, tell us how you feel when you hear a definition like that or an example like that. How does it manifest in your everyday life?
Well, you know, much of what I have experienced since being spirited back has some foundation. And that foundation, as I studied the Holy Bible there growing up in Carroll County, Maryland, and I discovered there in Revelation, the book of Revelation, when it's talking about his feet, meaning about the Christ. And then I learned in the book of Matthew about out of Egypt have I called my son, in the 5th chapter there, or 1st chapter thereabouts. And so I always knew that there was something about my skin that was grand. And so today, when I walk the streets of York or Harrisburg or Gettysburg, my second home, I recognize that there are others who would be looking at me various ways. But here's the thing, in my limited study and education, but I learned about a man by the name of Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, considered a social, an anthropologist of sorts. And they say that he believed much that the Constitution was anti-slavery. But Charles Darwin also had a hierarchy based on the size of the brain and his studies of anthropology. And so for the Negro man, we would have not had the same level of intelligence as our white counterparts. And much of what was happening in the 18th century was based on, I guess you could say, Darwinism, that book, Origin of Species in 1859.
Yes.
And then as I moved,
read that.
Yes. So as I moved towards the 19th century and we saw Reconstruction, there were some who had been in slavery, but were able to get more than their Negro counterparts because of their skin color. I guess you could say those who were mulatto, those who had African blood in them and European blood, they were oftentimes privileged to get a little bit more than those who were of darker skin. My skin have darkened over the years, but even in my youth, in my 20s and 30s, and even when I was excavating the bodies off the battlefield at Gettysburg, I was privileged to get a subcontractor job, and I believe it's because of my skin color.
Now, Mr. King, can you recall any that is similar to what Mr. Biggs have just stated?
Well, I think often of the movement in which segregation, where there was a continual demise of the Negro, and where there was also a time in which we were fighting towards the civil rights movement of justice and equality. And in opposition of segregation, we understood that the fight and the playing grounds was one in which there had been a 400-year or so head start. You cannot take someone who has been in power for that long and who has dominated in their space by demeaning another culture, tell them that they are no longer allowed to act or behave in that way and not expect retaliation. That we understood, that was clear. And that was clear, and even in terms of what water fountains or bathrooms that we were able to use in which we fought against. And once you strip someone of their so-called right to be able to demean you or demise your character, and they are no longer have the ability to outright call you a name, you still have not dealt with the psyche that still believes otherwise. So that means that it will continue by nature, whether it be subconsciously or not, in which they will continue to demean by nature. It has not happened overnight. It will not go away overnight. And in whether or not it be in media or whether or not it be on our television screens, in which we see representation or don't see representation, there is an idea of betterment that will continue to be fueled unless it's challenged.
Dr. King, I was wondering, have you witnessed microaggressions against Black women in this experience?
I have witnessed microaggressions, often so. The one microaggression, I'll say, is in which there, as it relates to the Black woman, in opposition of a white woman, and their ability to be a human being, I would say that Eartha Kitt comes to mind. And Eartha Kitt's visit to the White House during the time of Lyndon B. Johnson, and her visit, and when she was asked to speak, and she spoke out against the injustices in terms of what she saw and what she witnessed, and in turn, making the First Lady cry. Making someone cry is not an injustice. Making someone cry is when you are speaking your truth, when you are speaking about circumstance, and you feel that you have an outlet. I too had the same outlet to convene with Lyndon B. Johnson, and to convene and speak on the truth. There was no tears on his end. Had there been, who knows what would have happened to me. But she was outright ostracized, and she was outright, what do you call it?
Blackball, I think is what you're trying to say. That's something during our time they tend to use on.
Yes, where she was no longer invited to be a part of the industry in which she so greatly graced our presence, the Hollywood industry.
Now, You are both abolitionists
Mhm.
and drum major for justice, as Dr. King might put it. Did you experience microaggression among white or black social justice collaborators? Taking into consideration that microaggressions are not limited to race.
Well, the Negro man has a grand past. His foundations in being the development of irrigation and mathematics and astronomy. And I learned these things by reading and being with those who were learned men. You see, I was privy to hear conversations as a businessman there in Gettysburg. And so I learned a lot about the history of the Negro that was only spoken about in small circles. But I think very much about it into the question you spoke about with how microaggressions have impacted women of color, Negro women. I can only think about Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth.
Yes.
Because these women did not care. It didn't matter about their skin color. Harriet going 13 times back and forth to the north and returning took courage. Her leading men onto slave plantations with her rifle in hand took courage. Or even Sojourner Truth at that women's conference there in New York. And Fred Douglass was there. And Fred Douglass appeared to be a little bit timid about what he was saying. And Sojourner Truth stood up and said, "Fred, say what you mean. Talk to the people." And so it didn't matter to Sojourner Truth what her skin complexion was, nor to Harriet. And so I believe that being the nurturers in the Black or Negro family, they have taught their children mostly to look beyond their skin color and keep in their heart and keep in their mind, and then look to the Lord for what they're going to achieve. Not based on what they see, but what they know they have the ability, the innate ability to achieve, just as their ancestors in the colonial African days, pre-slavery, I guess you could say. And so with abolition, even with Fred Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison being partners with in the abolition movement, I recall the story when Fred Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison were at the courthouse there in Harrisburg. And a white mob came because they heard that they were there. And they had to whisk both Garrison and Douglass out through the back door of the gathering. But they were working together. But even that didn't last all the whole time that they were friends. For after about a 30-year friendship, they began to separate because Fred Douglass wanted to do more things. And he even got involved in raising Negro troops during the Civil War, including 2 of his sons. And so once you know who you are, as obviously Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth did, and Fred Douglass, it didn't matter so much about the skin color. They knew what they were able to do because the Creator had given them that innate genius to do.
Now, I had a question that came in, and the question was that, Mr. Beggs, during your time, they said it wasn't microaggression, it was just aggression. And Mr. King, during your time, it wasn't microaggression, it was just aggression. Yours from dealing with enslavement and those people who were chasing our freedom seekers, and you dealing with the KKK. Now, how do both of you feel about telling our audience the difference? Because both of you have experienced aggression and not necessarily microaggression. Let's start with, we can do it in time. We can start with you and then lead you on up to the 60s. And
Well, you know, sir, that even the war itself had many names. One was the War of Aggression, the war between the North and the South. You see, our white counterparts thought that it was their God-given right to enslave because it was necessary for them to have the economic power that they had. We were chattel. If you know what chattel is just like cattle. You can brand them, you can put reins on them, and you can make them do what you choose to do. It was simply aggression that changed over in time, but in my time, we had to escape. But if we were accepted, like myself and a few other men who started the Sons of Goodwill, you see, even in the National Cemetery after the Gettysburg Battle, the first Negro man wasn't allowed to be buried there until 1894, some 30 years later. Henry Gooden of the 121st U.S. Colored Infantry, colored troops. And so aggression during that time meant that you had to accept your lot in life, but we tried as best we could to teach our children if they wanted to achieve, then one of the first things they had to do, and I taught mine, was learn to read. Because Fred Douglass said, once you learn to read, you will be forever free.
So, Mr. King, we know that Dr. King, we know that you have experienced aggression during the civil rights movement, and tell us a little bit about how all of that started. Tell us, how did you get that started, and how was the aggression, not microaggression, how did that come about, or how did it look?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the formation of the KKK as an organization was a retaliation towards freedom. In essence, once it became on record that the Negro was free, only months later would the KKK form from a retaliation standpoint. And that retaliation has continuously been the cycle during the fight for justice. If there is a margin of seemingly progress, there, hence you can expect the retaliation. So as we would continue to make strides as it pertains to acts, we could anticipate, we could count on the fact that there would be retaliation. Much of our movement, we had to move and counter, almost understanding that from the legal grounds and as well as from the physical grounds, that we would have to be ready for retaliation. Now, we spoke earlier towards microaggressions not always dealing with Black versus white. And when you look at how there were different understandings of how to push the needle in the marginalization. If you look at my good brother Malcolm,
yes,
who I do love and I do respect and honor, and who we did find mutual grounds. His forceful nature with aggression towards aggression is something that I was greatly opposed to. I believed in moving in peace. I believed in legislative moves. I believed his belief was more so fighting fire with fire, because if you turn the other cheek and allow them to slap that one, he somehow thought that was Well, it was. There was no thinking. It was the meaning. But the divide in how to go about bringing forth justice created a dynamic of microaggression even amongst the Negro community.
Indeed, indeed.
I was often referred to as an Uncle Tom. I was often referred to as that because I believed in not fighting back aggressively, meeting aggression with aggression. And this would also often cause opposition in terms of even strategic components of how to go about getting civil justice.
So, Mr. King, you're pretty much saying that just like microaggression did not necessarily have to be white against black or black against white, it could be white against white and black against black.
Is absolutely correct.
Well,
Mr. Cook's question in regard to that, during the particularly gruesome work that you had to do during the Civil War, how was the interaction between you as the person who was in charge of all the other men doing that particularly gruesome work? Did they feel that they were being disrespected in having to do that kind of work? And how was their interaction with you?
Indeed. Well, I don't believe that they felt that there was an over-under, that they were subservient in the same way in which the white master or the plantation or the leader was, and Samuel Beisinger was the one who was the superintendent of the grave digging and the reinterring of the bodies. I was a subcontractor, and then I had those that I could help. But I would like to return to something that Dr. King was saying, and I've read his book, Stride Towards Freedom. He was speaking quite often about the Negro's strides, and I can say there was quite a bit of parallel. You see, during the 1800s, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, there were the slave codes. And then following that period of time, in 1867 or so to about, just about 20, 30 more years before the turn of the century, there were the black codes. But they were still, as Dr. King has said quite eloquently.
You know, I'll ask another question of both of you. Being spirited back, reading our newspapers, I know that it makes both of you uncomfortable because of how we are behaving as human beings today. Could both of you just give us in seeing that we are still in turmoil? And we'll start with you, Mr. King.
One of the articles that I read had spoken towards a gentleman whose name escapes me. He is a young man that took a knee.
Yes, Colin
Kaepernick.
Kaepernick, I believe that's right.
Yes,
Yes, I read many articles about that.
Young man that took a knee in terms of justice and the disposition of those things that were going on in America. My disappointment was connected with, again, the economic injustices that allowed for the campaign and his to dampen, in a sense, and otherwise the league in which he plays for that has its own economy, and that I see really only two problems. One, that there is all white ownership within the league in which he plays for. And two, a league in which the Negro is getting paid such an astronomical amount of resources that they may not come together in the way in which we did for the bus boycott. In other words, this was the next movement that I was moving towards, which was an economic movement. If you don't like the way in which an economy moves, then do not purchase the merchandise, do not move. And I made mention of Coca-Cola. But there seems to be no measure in which a man will come together and stand against not soliciting an ecosystem that does not serve their cause.
We do have a question coming. I think, Allison, could you?
Sure. The first part of this question is, how do you approach the aggressions that come from our government and through systemic racism? And then as a larger expansion on that, Dr. King, you seem to hope that legislation would bring about such justice. Do you still have that hope that that's a route that's possible within our government today? And if not, what's your hope for justice today?
I continue to have hope. Faith is the substance of things that are hoped for, the evidence of things which are not seen. Should I not have had hope, even during my time, we would have not pushed the needle even during the movement of the Civil Rights era. In a time where we are still faced with microaggressions, even in the White House, even in having, from which I understood, to finally be able to achieve a Negro president, in which his slate had to remain clean. In no way would he be able to move in a way even relative to the gentleman that followed him, in which moved in a very similar fashion to Hitler.
Disgraceful, disgraceful.
If he were to make any, passes out of woman or her nature, or speak outright towards anything, he would not have been able to stand tall in the seat of presidency. He would not be following that presidency, having a African-American vice president is something that I did not know would happen. Even she stands up against many things that, as I mentioned earlier, a white woman would not have to face being in the same position. Though I still have hope. I still have hope that, as I was mentioned earlier, that this comes in strides, that we have pushed the margin, and as it does continue to be frustrating at times, that there still is, as it pertains to policy. And I read the other day in terms of in the Supreme Court.
Oh, yes.
There has been, the needle has been moved to have the acceptance of an African-American female.
Yes.
In the Supreme Court.
I read that.
Once again, we may not be where we want to be, but we aren't where we were.
Pardon me.
Interesting. Go ahead, Mr. Bishop.
I was going to say, if I could add on to what Dr. King has said, appears that books haven't been spirited back into this 21st century, that it's been my reading of books that have allowed me to understand more about my people and about those that oppose our gains. You see, as Dr. King was referring to the strides, I thought about that education was the key, and our faith. Although my mother was born into slavery, she had a strong faith. And so faith and education were the two things that kept. In fact, I understand, Dr. King, that one of your the young men that you mentored, so education and leadership training and mentoring, and that was Reverend Jesse Jackson and his son wrote a book called The Fourth Symphony. And that book talked about what you have talked about, but it began back in the 19th century, I believe, even prior to that, because the first part of the symphony was the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, and then it went into slavery, the chattel slavery, and the Reconstruction. We made some gains and some strides, but even then there was the civil rights movement. As you have mentioned, it was about economic power, and I knew that certainly when I began to buy properties around Gettysburg, so that I could be an owner and I could also employ others. And so education first, faith being the second thing, that we need to continue to face all the difficulties in this 21st century. But if we teach our children to believe in themselves and to have hope, as we talk about from the book of Hebrews and 11, although they might have obstacles, they can still press on and push on. So, Dr. King, I'm so glad that we are of the same faith, and we understand that that faith is things that we can't see, but it's the evidence of things that are hoped for. Yes, indeed, sir. Indeed.
Yes, sir.
I think we have another question coming in for you too. I am just so delighted to have both of you here, two greats. One of the 1800s and one of the 1900s. This is just marvelous. Both of you were dealing with social justice in your own way. This is to piggyback on what was just said. How do you feel about social justice today versus the way it may have looked in the 1800s or 1900s in terms of getting things done? Now, you spoke on that the needle has moved a little bit. Give me a something I could actually chew on to make me believe as a person here today that things actually are better, specifically in the social justice realm.
Well, in being spirited back, I have noticed a stronger presence as it relates to media, which during my time, there were only few outlets. The Negro did not have a voice if he was not able to obtain audience on that outlet. There are ways in which even those that may watch me at this time that I speak and hear my voice and have access to a platform in which we did not have. And I have seen the level of influence in which the Negro has been able to take a stance towards these issues. One thing I would warn about is not to get so admiring towards the ability to be seen that you forget that the way in which to really truly gain power will continue to be with the power economics. If we fall short of ownership, if we fall short of the ability to control the dollar, the golden rule is he who controls the gold makes the rules. If we remember that, then we can be on course in terms of how to use these outlets in which we now have a broader voice.
Okay, do you want to add anything to that, Mr. Biggs?
Well, I would simply add that, and I'm not going to apologize because education still sits at the forefront of my mind. I'm thinking in terms of once one is able to, no matter what their circumstance may have been at birth, once they are educated then their lives can drastically change. Phyllis Wheatley's life changed in the 18th century when her Quaker family adopted her, and she became a writer and corresponded with Thomas Jefferson. And Benjamin Banneker was elevated when he finished the work that had begun at the White House without having any much of a formal education in architecture. He was able to lay the foundation. Even those that helped build the White House there had not had much of a formal education. And so education remains key, and knowing what to do with your money. I know that there are many who sustained themselves because they had land. Some were given land after the official Emancipation Proclamation ended, but they were given land, and so they were able to live and then turn that same land over to their children. So I believe in this 21st century, if we can own property and land as it was in the days of old, it could be still the same, that's worth gold, just having your own property and land.
We had a question because we had asked people to ask us questions earlier. And they actually thought you all, the two of you, would be talking about mostly aggression happened during your time. And their comment was, during our time, they have to use microaggressions. Because otherwise they would be treated badly if they were just straight out aggressive against a particular group of people. Do you believe that is the case, why microaggression is so prevalent now?
Well, I do think that there is something there, but you also cannot take away the way in which one thinks about another and what that does to the psyche, whether or not one knows that they are mistreating someone, if they are uninformed pertaining to a particular culture or background. It may not be because they are trying to suppress the way that they are behaving, but because they do not understand how to communicate. So in times where we, if I am continually told psychologically or otherwise that I am better, now, I may not be told this because someone said physically or someone said by way of voice that I am better. But if I were to look on the billboard, if I open up a magazine, if I look on television, and everywhere I see myself, and I did not see another category, this may in turn make me believe that I am better. This will also in turn not give me an outlet to understand that in which, or that person in which I do not understand. I believe that it all contributes towards microaggressions and how people are treated.
Quite interesting, Mr. King. Quite interesting.
Indeed, that idea of imagery is very important. You know, during the times of the chattel slavery, oftentimes if the master would get sick, the enslaved would say, we are sick, as identifying with the master. I believe it's something I read in this 21st century about a Stockholm syndrome or something. If one is hanging around with a robber or a cheat or a murderer, they may even become have affection for that person who has is oppressing them. And so I learned this word. I was with a young man and he used the word, I shouldn't call him young, but he used the word iconography. And I asked him what that meant, and he talked about pictures that you see often. And so I read once that Frederick Douglass was perhaps more photographed than Abraham Lincoln. And Douglas said that he kept a stern face in most cases, because the image of the Negro has been so much jolly and happy all the time that when he was photographed, he remained stoic. And so the imagery that we show, and of course, with regards to aggression, in my time in the 1800s, you knew who you were. You put your head down. If you saw someone and you expected them to not see you looking back at them, then you were able to put your hand and you could live another day. But today, I imagine, Dr. King, you've seen that even in some of those, when you have gone to the White House to talk with the presidents and senators, that they may have said one thing in close quarters, but when it came to passing legislation, the filibustering and so forth may have taken place. So image is the whole thing. And I just told my children that they were beautiful because they were made in God's image. And I think that's something that we have to continue to do in our families, is to talk about imagery, who you are, whose image you're in. Well, that goes a long way.
I would love for this to go on. We're winding down, but I think we have maybe another question, and then I'm going to ask each of you to wrap up. This has been a wonderful session. Do we have a question, Allison?
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I gleaned from your answer previously that representation was an important strategy in helping to be distracted by microaggressions in your work for justice. I was wondering if you had any other strategies that have helped you deal with that.
I would say that another strategy is similar to what we are experiencing here today. As people become aware of what is a microaggression or otherwise, they can be more conscious about their presence and the presence of others. Mm-hmm. This would go, and not just as it pertains to black and white, but even as it yields to colorism, mm-hmm. even as it yields to ageism, any form of agency in which one might have, being aware in which they perhaps are not completely understanding of their agency and how it may impact another being. I think awareness, as it has in your day, as mm-hmm. it has in mine, will continue to be the avenue in which we make strides.
Great answer, Mr. King. I'm hoping that our audience is learning or are paying attention to the information that the two of you are sharing. I cannot thank you enough for deciding to be spirited back in William Goodridge's home. Mm-hmm. That is important. 123 East Philadelphia Street in York, Pennsylvania. We are a program of Christmas Odyssey to York. And I mean, to have two greats at the same time, boy, that's such a. We are wrapping up now, and just give us a 30 seconds of what you would like to tell our audience about moving forward and keeping hope.
Well, keeping hope is one, having faith. And just like we used during the times in my day when I would take those in the home and take them to Quakertown to get them to Philadelphia, to get them to New York and Canada, they looked at the Big Dipper, the North Star. And so I would tell young people today, those aspiring to be businessmen and businesswomen, to be, as this century they call it, entrepreneurship. Just to keep looking up. Look at that star. And whatever you get to is a point further than where you were standing, is what I would say to them.
Okay, Mr. King. Well, actually, Mr. King, I can't help myself. I just cannot help myself. If you could say a few lines from I Have a Dream. If I know that was so long ago.
Yeah, yes, it was, and it was memorialized on television. Much of that speech was not prepared,
Really?
particularly the "I Have a Dream" component.
Okay, well, we're not gonna put you on the spot.
We would like to thank our living history interpreters for spiriting back Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., interpreter John Trey Williams, and Basil Biggs, interpreter Eric Jackson Sr. I want to remind our audience that May's episode topics will be how men of color are viewed through photography currently versus 1800s and early 1900s. Our living history interpreters will be William C. Goodridge and Lydia Hamilton Smith. We would like to thank our presenting sponsor, National Endowment for Humanities. We would also like to thank Crispus Attucks York, National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, Explore York, and Sites of Conscience. On behalf of the Goodridge Freedom Center and Underground Railroad Museum, Kelly Summerford, Allison Renner, and Equina Washington, good night.